the year. We've been trying to do this for a while, so it's finally nice to have you all here together in the room. So tonight we're going to be discussing the current situation in Latin America and how it's developing. And Rebecca, I'll hand it over to you to introduce everyone.
Yeah, hello. Also from my part, I'm really happy to welcome here Kerr, who has been working for Transparency International, or is still working for it since December 2013. And Transparency International is about a research process of the upcoming Government Defense Anti-Corruption Index. And she's also worked at the embassy in Colombia and has worked for the British Council in Colombia and projects like arts and governance and human rights and climate change. And I'm also really happy to welcome Rodolfo, who has founded Branding Latin America and has worked as a journalist in Argentina before and is now living in London. And then we also have Javier Farje, who was born in Peru and is now editor for Latin American Bureau. So, yeah, we want to start? Yeah, sure, we'll start. Do you want to read here? So I can kind of between.
Okay, so hi everyone. I'll try and keep this as kind of informal as possible because we're quite a small group. So yeah, my name is Kerr. I work on the Government Defence Anti-Corruption Index for Transparency International's UK programme, but we have a global scope. And previously to that, I worked in Colombia and also Paraguay, and I've written academically on Paraguay as well. So I've done a kind of slightly snazzy prezi for you that I hope. We'll just go back to the first one for now. I hope will kind of prevent boredom in the presentation. So first of all, what do we do with Transparency International Defence and Security Programme? Our purpose is to reduce corruption in the defence and security sector, and our overall goals are to raise awareness of corruption and to provide practical tools to counter corruption risk, to collaborate with governments and international organisations to enhance transparency in the defence sector, to work with defence companies in raising industry standards, and to develop centres and international networks of expertise on corruption in the defence sector. But what do we mean when we talk about corruption in the defence sector? At Transparency International, we define corruption as the abuse of entrusted power for personal gain. And the typology of defence and security corruption risks that you can see here gives a bit more detail about the ways in which corruption manifests itself in this very high-risk sector. So you can see we kind of branch them under 5 main topics. So you've got political, financial, personnel, operations and procurement risks, and underneath that you've got lots of subcategories. These are the ways that corruption manifests itself in the defence sector. So we don't just talk about bribery, for example. We might talk about small bribes of personnel, like army members or the police. Or we might talk about subcontractors in the procurement sector. So we talk about very specific things within corruption risk in the defence sector. But why does corruption in the defence sector matter? Well, in the defence sector, we're talking about huge amounts of money, with typical contracts being in the millions or billions of dollars. And added to the fact that most of these deals are classified as top secret, and there's a kind of tendency towards secrecy in the defence sector, this leads to a heightened level of corruption risk in this area. What does that mean? Well, first of all, it has an effect on public trust. Because corruption in the armed forces erodes the public's trust in those forces and undermines their legitimacy. Just one major scandal can deeply undermine the public's perception of the armed forces, and it can take years to rebuild their reputation. Pervasive small-scale corruption, like bribery, or having to pay bribes to the police, affects the daily lives of individuals. I'm sure you all know somebody, if not in the UK then elsewhere, that's had to pay a bribe to the police. And that can build resentment in a population. It also affects trust in companies, who are often large-scale employers and a major source of investment in a country. So corruption in the defence sector also affects governmental integrity, because funds from the defence sector can be siphoned off by the ruling elite to finance their election campaigns or for personal gain. And when defence and security establishments are corrupt, the integrity of the government is affected, and the government can lose legitimacy and public trust, as we've already discussed. It's also important for economic and social development, because corruption is costly and it's a waste of a country's scarce resources. Defence and security, as we've already discussed, are often really expensive areas of a country's national budget, and that's even when they're conducted with integrity. When corruption occurs, it can be an extremely costly drain on the national budget. And government money lost via corruption in the defence sector could have been better spent on healthcare, education, infrastructure, or many other means of development. So it's important for that reason as well. It's also important in the area of security and defence itself, because corruption can fatally undermine security strategies and have a real impact on the effectiveness of military operations. It can lead to the risk of troops being ill-equipped, high flows of illicit arms, drugs and human trafficking, and it can also cause information to be misused by organised crime or terrorist organisations. And because of that, it compromises the safety of both troops and civilians. And then lastly, in peacekeeping and peacemaking, corruption often tends to fall to the wayside as an issue in peacekeeping efforts, and to be considered as a kind of governance issue that can be tackled once the peacekeeping efforts have taken place in their entirety. But what we say normally at Transparency International is that actually corruption is often central to the conflict, and its resolution is really, addressing corruption is crucial to the resolution of conflict, particularly because the perception of corruption can cause conflict to be reignited on either side, and because illicit activities fuel the black economy and are linked to organised crime. Peacemaking and peacekeeping operations can be hampered by corruption, and it can undermine their legitimacy. Corrupt activities can fund insurgencies, they can fuel instability, and they endanger peacekeeping forces. And when corruption occurs, when corrupt activities are undertaken by the peacekeeping troops themselves, this obviously undermines the legitimacy of the peacekeeping operation. So now I'm just going to tell you quickly a bit about the Government Defence Anti-Corruption Index, which is the index that I work on. And it's one of the tools that we've put in place to counter corruption risk in the defence sector as far as governments are concerned, and we tend to call it the GI. The index, which we first carried out in 2013, so we published the first version last year, is the first real analysis of corruption in the defence sector, and it aims to give governments, civil society and the armed forces the tools that they need to avoid the dangers and the inefficiencies that corruption in the defence sector can bring. You're probably aware of other indices that Transparency International produces, like the Corruption Perceptions Index. One thing that I would mention is that this isn't a perceptions index, it's an analysis of corruption risk in the defence sector. So it doesn't look at kind of what public perceptions are, although that is one of the questions included in the index. This is an analysis of risk and how that can be addressed. And it's an assessor-based index, so that means that we send or we recruit a lead researcher with the requisite expertise to undertake a detailed questionnaire of 77 questions structured around the typology that we saw earlier in the countries that we assess. Assessors tend to be based in the country that they're researching, and that's so that they can use both kind of written sources and interviews as a means of as sources for the research. So whether that's kind of academic written pieces, newspaper articles, government websites, it might also include interviews with government officials, interviews with civil society organisations, journalists, NGOs. So it will draw on a wide range of sources. Once they've, so here you can see kind of the process of the research. Once it's been carried out by the assessor, it's peer reviewed by 2 independent experts who are also kind of qualified in corruption in the defence sector. And it's also sent to the government, who are given their chance to provide comments. And it's also sent to our national chapters for them to provide their comments on, because they're kind of the real experts on corruption in that country. Once all of the countries have been assessed, we then kind of bring all of the data together and compile it into a report which analyses the global and regional trends of the data, and that's the government's index report. Please do take a copy. There are lots of copies over there on the edge if you'd like to take one at the end. If you don't take them, I'll be carrying them home, so I strongly encourage all of you to take one. So I'll just quickly show you the results. These are the results by banding for 2013. In 2015, when we publish the next results, we'll be covering 135 countries. I don't know, can you see this okay? Maybe mine's a turn. But I mean, I know that some people will just be interested in seeing their own country, maybe. If that's okay, Chris, that would be good, thank you. Yeah, great. Okay, so I might just give you a quick chance to have a look for your own country. So we can see that 2/3 of the countries scored in band D or below, meaning that they have high to extremely high levels of corruption risk. Only 2, Australia and Germany, were found to have strong controls in their defence sector. 50% of countries don't publish their defence budget or do so minimally. 85% of countries lack robust legislative scrutiny of defence policy, and 90% of countries have no effective system for whistleblowing and no protection for whistleblowers in the defence sector. And here you can also just see the countries in map form, so that's what it looks like. Lots of these black areas in this year when we cover it for the 2015 publication will soon be coloured because we're covering 135 rather than 82 countries. And these are the results for the Americas. So generally the Americas didn't do too badly. They scored quite badly in operations, which is that green line that you can see there. That was a global trend, but particularly in Latin America, the Latin American countries tended to do very badly in operations in comparison to the rest of their results. Okay, you probably didn't like that one. Thank you. So that's all fine, but I understand that that most of you are probably here because you want to hear about Latin America, and particularly in relation to the counter-narcotics debate. So I thought that I'd tell you a little bit about how this relates to that and how the GI results can be used in that analysis. Corruption in the defence sector can help to fuel the narcotics trade by providing illicit funds and weapons. Corruption defence personnel are often also complicit in organised criminal activity. And there's a significant amount of crossover between corruption risk in the defence sector and the instability posed by the trafficking of drugs in Latin America. For example, if weaponry isn't disposed of properly, it can end up in the hands of criminal gangs and drug traffickers. And likewise, if personnel are not properly held to account for their behaviour, they may become involved in organised crime. And the chances of this happening are higher when staff members are not paid on time or through regularised payment systems. So, although all corruption in the defence sector is probably relevant to this debate to a certain extent, because corruption leads to forces being ill-equipped and ill-prepared to tackle narcotics gangs, today I'm just going to talk you through a few areas of the GI, particularly asset disposal, the payment of personnel, and the punishment of personnel who are suspected of being involved in criminal activity. But first, it's worth just asking, what is the extent of penetration of organised crime into the armed forces and defence personnel in Latin America? And one of the questions in the index aims to analyse just that. Argentina and Brazil, maybe somewhat predictably, score quite well in this area. And I should mention actually that we didn't cover all of the Latin American countries, so if we skip back, oh yeah, you can see here. So these are the countries that we covered in the Americas. So I'm kind of limited to talking about those. We will be kind of covering more. We'll be covering Peru in the 2015 index, the Dominican Republic in Central America. So yeah, we'll be covering more this year. I'm limited in scope in what I can talk to you about for 2013. But Argentina and Brazil scored well in the area of asset disposal, with very little evidence to suggest that they're, in the area of organised crime and its links to personnel. Very little evidence to suggest that personnel have been involved in criminal activity. But maybe more surprisingly, the assessment found that there's actually significant room for improvement in Chile. Although the armed forces have developed specific actions around drugs and corruption matters, the assessor nevertheless concluded that organised crime affects state structures and institutions. In Colombia, a number of officials have been found guilty of collusion with paramilitary activities, and organisations like Human Rights Watch have also denounced the involvement of paramilitary groups and other criminal bands into politics, particularly in the area of defence and security. Likewise, in Mexico, a number of high-profile cases relating to the penetration of organised crime into the military in May 2012 were flagged by the assessor, and that includes 2 generals who were linked to the Beltran-Leyva cartel. In Venezuela, the assessment demonstrates that this penetration goes right up to the highest levels, with senior officials in the Ministry of Defence accused of being involved with the FARC guerrilla in Colombia, as well as in the drugs trade in general. No prosecution has been brought against a number of senior army officials accused of drug trafficking, and the armed forces have been involved in the war against drugs since 2007, which the assessor mentions may have caused widespread corruption in the military. So the penetration of organised crime into defence forces is a profound problem in Latin America, and it seems to pose a greater threat in countries that are most affected by the narcotics industry, where the opportunity for involvement and the chances of higher profits are obviously greater. And I should probably note that question 18 of the GI also asks if there's well-resourced policing to investigate organised crime and corruption within the defence services. And nearly all countries, with the only exception being Argentina, scored really badly in that area. So that's definitely an area of recommendation for the region in the future. So I just want to have a kind of closer look at how this plays out on the ground, and how, if attention is not paid to corruption risk in the defence sector, arms can end up in the wrong hands. So we're just going to talk about asset disposal. This is how not to get rid of your assets, by the way. Dump them in the car park somewhere. In her article, beyond the pay current illicit activities of the armed forces in Central America, Christina Money points to a number of high-profile cases in El Salvador, Guatemala and Honduras of arms mysteriously disappearing only to turn up later in the hands of criminal groups taken from military stockpiles. And that's why transparency in the disposal of assets is really important and key to ending the violent conflict posed by organised criminal activity and narcotics groups. And 2 questions in the index consider whether independent and transparent scrutiny of asset disposals are conducted by defence establishments, and whether these reports are made publicly available, and whether the proceeds of the assets are transparent. So asset disposal is an area in which Colombia performs fairly strongly. It doesn't score the full marks, but it scores 3 out of the 4 marks in this area. Colombia maintains control over the disposal of assets, and details of the disposals can also be found in the General Report of Defence and Security Agency to Congress. These disposals are scrutinised by the country's General Accountant and by the Inspector General. However, the Colombia assessment does also make the point that more could be done to make the results of these findings transparent and public. But Brazil, Argentina and Mexico scored less well in this area. So although they have controls over the disposal of assets in these countries, there are shortcomings in the strength of these controls. And there's no or highly abbreviated public information on the procedures or controls in place to account for weaponry. Venezuela is kind of an interesting case because asset disposal is undertaken for all state departments in general, not just by the Ministry of Defence. At Transparency International, we would recommend that it were undertaken by the Ministry of Defence itself because of the kind of particularly dangerous nature of weaponry and the risk of it going missing if it is misplaced. And we'd recommend that the Ministry of Defence does so in a transparent, accountable way that addresses corruption risk. So that's asset disposal. Now I'd like to talk fairly briefly, if possible, about the payment of personnel and why that poses a corruption risk in the defence sector. So when staff aren't paid on time, corruption risk increases because of their potential proximity to and knowledge of organised crime, meaning that they may look to supplement their income with criminal activity. This also happens sometimes because personnel at the higher levels skim the salaries of personnel at the lower levels, meaning that personnel working in day-to-day enforcement don't have enough money to survive and look to corrupt means to supplement their income. And of course the risk of personnel's involvement in organised crime is higher in countries which have an established narcotics trade because this kind of activity is more prolific. So in her article, Manny points out that in some Central American countries, particularly in El Salvador, retired military officers, and this is a quote, spoke of frustration in being unable to maintain their previous standard of living on a fixed pension, and with no effective structures provided by the military institution to smooth the transition. And when that's the case, officers might start to look to supplement their income via organised crime. But what she found was that officers in Nicaragua, on the other hand, were trained in a second degree, a civilian degree like accounting, law or public administration, which meant that they were able to take a career in a second occupation if the need arose. So in this vein, a number of the questions in the GI address the payment of personnel and how they're promoted. In Argentina, Brazil and Chile, those 2 countries scored well in this area of the government index. And the assessors reported that evidence suggested that staff were paid on time, they were paid the correct salary, and that the payment system was clear and transparent. Likewise, in Mexico, staff were paid on time and they received the correct pay, but the transparency of the system was questioned slightly. But in Colombia, on the other hand, the payment system hasn't been brought quite up to date. So after receiving 130,000 demands from military personnel, an increment in salary that had been promised for several years was finally paid. And additionally, an army personnel family subsidy was withdrawn in 2009, and the payment system is neither published nor publicly available. In Venezuela, although army members appear to be paid according to an established system, there were complaints from civilian personnel, so that's those working in the Ministry of Defence rather than in the armed forces itself, that pay was received late, that they were working without a contract, and that they weren't receiving social security payments, which are a legal obligation of the state in Venezuela. Okay. So now I just want to talk quickly about the kind of punishments and addressing corruption in personnel in the defence sector in Latin America. Because just because personnel are not paid on time obviously doesn't mean that they will engage in criminal activity, it just increases the corruption risk in that area. But it's also important to look at those who have been implicated in criminal activity, how they are punished, and whether a clear stance against corruption is taken by the defence forces. Personnel contribute to the functioning of organised crime when they're complicit in its activity and when they're not held to account for their behaviour. And that means holding all staff accountable. I can't emphasise that enough. It's not just about the staff on the ground, it's also about holding people right to the higher echelons of the Ministry of Defence accountable for their behaviour. And the index asks whether there are effective measures in place for personnel who are found to have taken part in bribery and corrupt activities. And if there's public evidence that these measures are being carried out, like disciplinary sanctions such as dismissal and prosecution. So in this area, Argentina, Brazil and Chile again scored well, thanks to established codes of conduct, which put in place measures for punishing civil servants caught committing corrupt acts. And they also see that these sanctions are enforced by the relevant authorities in these countries. Colombia also scored reasonably well because media reports show that increasing action is being taken against corruption in the army, although, I mean, this is from the report for 2013. If any of you have read the news about Colombia, I'm sure you'll be publishing a blog on a scandal that happened in the defence sector in Colombia this week. You'll know that more could be done for definite, and I think the score might be going down essentially. But at the time that this was written, there was a high-profile prosecution of former army chief Mario Montoya, who was accused of receiving millions of pesos from an ex-paramilitary leader. But in Mexico, the effectiveness of the measures in place to sanction personnel was seen to be relatively low, and the number of administrative sanctions given was also questioned. Likewise, in Venezuela, although the Ministry of Defence has got a Controller General and an Inspector who are in charge of supervising transparency, there's no public evidence at all that any measures have been taken against personnel who are suspected of bribery or corruption, and accusations against high-ranking military officials have not been investigated at all. So I hope you've kind of got a bit of a flavour of the government index and seen that it's a highly useful tool for analysing corruption risk in the defence sector and why that's important for countering the narcotics trade and other forms of organised crime in Latin America and in the world in general. Too often corruption tends to be considered as a kind of add-on or a governance issue, as I mentioned earlier. But what we try to advocate at TI is that when corruption risk in the defence sector isn't addressed, that can hinder stabilisation efforts. And as we've seen here, when corruption risk is not addressed, it provides narcotics gangs and other organised criminals with the illicit funds and the weapons that are needed for their activities. And military personnel who might be implicated in that activity or turn a blind eye to it and not effectively punished. And unfortunately, until this corruption risk is addressed, the cycle of conflict will continue to occur. And this is one of the tools that we've got at TI just to show that this is partly how the cycle of conflict can occur, but how if corruption risk is addressed, that's when you can finally get on the road to stability. And lastly, I just wanted to show you, if you're interested, a few ways that you can help our project. So the first is that we're always interested in students who can carry out research for us. And there are a number of kind of under-researched areas. It tends to be an under-researched area in general, corruption areas in which we would appreciate research. So if you're undertaking a master's or even your undergraduate studies and you need to do a dissertation, it might be interesting for you to have a look. Do feel free to ask me more about it afterwards. You can also email Sarge, who's our research lead, and his email address is up there. We have a number of internship opportunities coming up in the government index and also in the companies index, which is the sister project of the government index and looks at corruption risk in defence companies. And we're also looking for country assessors and peer reviewers for the government's index. So that's people with kind of expertise in corruption or defence or a very strong research background. If you know anyone or if you think that you would be qualified yourself, please do approach me or have a look on the website for more information at the call for assessors. And that's it.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I'll try to be brief so you can have the chance to ask questions. I was born in Peru and I'm going to talk about drugs, so it fits very nicely. First of all, I would like to dispel a misconception about the problem of drugs in Latin America, and it is that it is seen as a police problem, and it's not a police problem. It's more than that. Politics, it's economics, it's culture. Drugs operate, whether it's in Latin America or anywhere in the world, with the same principle of supply and demand. It has markets, you have suppliers, you have people who consume, and it operates on those principles. The difference is that drugs are an illegal activity. I think it's very important because when we are talking about drugs and development, that has a lot to do with the way drugs operate. I think it's very important to notice something which I think is crucial. Although there's some heroin coming from Latin America to the US, which is the main market for the drugs produced in Latin America, the main export of drugs from Latin America is cocaine. And the biggest market is the US. Everything related to cocaine is produced in the region. Nothing is produced outside Latin America. From the raw material, which is the coca leaf, to the cocaine and cocaine paste and crack cocaine and all that. That makes it a very interesting phenomenon because it is, it is an entirely regional problem. Most of the coca leaf, most of the cocaine and coca leaf are produced in the Andean countries, namely Colombia, Bolivia, and Peru. Peru at the moment has the biggest production of coca leaf, which is the raw material for cocaine. But that shifts and moves all the time depending on the circumstances. It hasn't always been the case. At the moment, my country has this dubious sort of privilege of being the main producer of coca leaf. But that wasn't always the case. At the moment, I think we are talking about around 46 to 47% of the whole production, the world production of coca leaf is in Peru. Bolivia follows and Colombia follows as well. And that has happened from the middle of the 19th century to the 1980s, 90s until now. So that's a very important issue that has a lot to do with the way cocaine operates and drugs operate in Latin America. Now, because Nixon around 40 years ago created this concept of war on drugs. The idea was to destroy drug trafficking, and it hasn't worked. That has not worked, and that's not something that I'm saying. The commission, called the Global Commission, the Global Commission on Drugs Policy issued a report in June 2011. I suggest that you download it from the internet, where they reached that conclusion. What happens is that, as I said, most of the coca leaf, all the coca leaves are produced in the Andean country, the main Andean countries, Peru, Colombia, and Bolivia. Most of the cocaine is produced in Colombia, by Colombia. There was a time when, because of Plan Colombia, which is something that was started around 2000, there was a big plan created by the US to fight and destroy the coca production in Colombia. And in a way it worked. It was minor victories, but what happened was that there was a time when, because of campaigns in Peru to eradicate coca leaves, the main production of coca leaf moved to Colombia. Colombia became at some point the main producer of coca leaf, and they were not only producing the coca leaf, but also they were producing the cocaine. Then it moved back to Peru. These minor victories and the practical destruction of the Medellin and Cali cartels, which were the biggest cartels of drugs, meant that the coca sort of gangs were not eradicated. They just moved to Mexico. Mexico took over from the Colombian cartels. Although these days there's a small cartels which are trying to rebuild Medellin, I think I understand. They're trying to rebuild their power they had before. There's been some problems there. What happened was that when the Cali and Medellin cartels were almost destroyed, they became itemized, and the small cartels were created, so small gangs of more entrepreneurial sort of drug traffickers were created in the region. Mexico became the main sort of route of cocaine from Latin America to the US. As I said to you at the beginning, drugs operate with the principle of supply and demand. The biggest market for cocaine or drugs is, surprise, surprise, the US, although the consumption of cocaine in Europe has grown in the last few years, and Europe constitutes, East and West constitute around 30% of the total consumption of cocaine in the world. Now, there's been a small reduction of consumption of cocaine in the US because it's been replaced by synthetic drugs, but the market remains more or less intact. And the figures I'm giving you come from the UN, they're sort of official studies. So US and Europe constitute most of the total market, and that's where the drugs go. Because of the conditions that change all the time in terms of drugs operate, the Atlantic has become the favorite route of traffickers that goes to Mexico or goes directly to the US. But also, there's a new element. The region has become a new market for the consumption of cocaine, for several reasons. One of them is that the production of the raw material and the cocaine is there, it's very close, therefore it's easy to trade. Because of the economic sort of growth of countries like Brazil. Brazil is one of the biggest markets of cocaine in Latin America these days. They have borders with Bolivia, that is a part of where the production of cocaine happens. Therefore it's easy for them to have the access, and because of the economic growth that they have been experiencing, they can afford, the new prosperous middle class can afford to consume cocaine. So the problem we have at the moment is that we are becoming in Latin America also a market for the consumption of cocaine. Again, I have to say drugs, but cocaine is the main problem here. The production of coca leaf and cocaine in the three Andean countries remain more or less the same. It has remained more or less the same for the last 20 years. There have been some shifts and changes, but they remain more or less the same. There's still a high supply of cocaine from these countries. Colombia is still the main maker, or the cocaine is mainly produced in Colombia. Mexico is the main distribution center, and Mexico has become more relevant from the year more or less 2000, when they started to take over from the Colombian cartels because of what I mentioned to you, the destruction of the Medellin and Cali cartels, Pablo Escobar and all that. Again, Brazil, because they have borders and a market, like at the time of the rubber boom, then they have become a major, not only market for the cocaine, but also through which the boats go, taking the Atlantic, because that's the favorite route, because the Pacific is more controlled these days. Now, there has been some shifts in the consumption of drugs, but also the production of drugs. Why? As I said, because there's very slight reduction of consumption of cocaine in the US, but also the inter-cartel fights, you know, that you must have read and seen how the cartels are fighting one another. That has created a problem in the way cocaine is supplied to the US. However, this fragmentation or this fight has not stopped the traffic, because what happens is that when one cartel is destroyed, another one replaces it. So it's always moving and shifting. It's a very dynamic activity where everything moves around. And what helps as well, and Emma has mentioned it already, is corruption at certain levels. When you talk about Mexico, for example, one of the reasons why Felipe Calderón, the former president, called the army to fight drugs was because it was supposed to be free of corruption, because the police forces are highly corrupt in Mexico. So the idea was, okay, the army is not corrupt anymore. Well, Emma has explained really well how it has become corrupt because of the infiltration of the drug cartels. Don't forget that the Los Zetas, you might have heard about the Zetas, the famous cartel. They were an elite group of police men who were supposed to fight the cartels. What they did was they left the army. They were bought by one of the cartels, I think it was the Juarez cartel, and they became a cartel themselves. So we're talking about a high level of corruption when they completely took off the uniforms and decided to join the whole thing. And they are one of the cruelest and the nastiest drug cartels that you have in Mexico at the moment. Now what happens is that because of this shift towards Mexico, all the parts of the region have become victims of this situation, mainly Central America, specifically Guatemala and Honduras. What happens is that because they have been spreading the wings, the drug cartels, parts, cities, the small towns in Honduras and Guatemala are totally controlled by different cartels. And they fight the war either by proxy or directly. So parts of Honduras and Guatemala that have been through years of political instability, have been trying to build a democracy, are suffering now the consequences of the drug caused by the Mexican cartels. That means that it has created contagion, it has infected countries which are now struggling to rebuild their democracies and their economy. The case of El Salvador is similar, with the Maras, which are the gangs that operate in El Salvador. This has been a kind of like an amnesty recently. I think the government has issued an amnesty trying to control that. So Central America has become a new route, but also the drug cartels are a very diverse business. They traffic people, extortion, etc., etc. And there have been massacres of immigrants who did not comply with the orders in Mexico by many immigrants from Central America trying to get to the US. What was the response on the particular case of Mexico? The response in Korea was high sort of repression, but also the government was corrupted by drugs. When the Uribe government, the far-right paramilitary groups had links with the drug cartels. He was never touched by that, he was a Teflon president. But many people in his entourage were imprisoned and were tried because of the links with the far-right paramilitary groups, which were linked to the drug cartels in Colombia. So that has corrupted, and the name has already explained to you how it corrupts governments. So basically what happens is that the US is not only the main market for our drugs, but also they supply the weapons that the governments need to fight the wars. Because you can easily buy a weapon, you go to a supermarket in Texas and you can buy weapons there. So what they do is basically they use legally acquired weapons and they cross the border back to Mexico. So the US is not only responsible for being the biggest market for our drugs, but also the biggest choice supplier of weapons, because it's easy to fight, to buy them there. Now, Mexico's response, and Felipe Calderón, the former president, was, let's go an all-out war. We're going to fight them and beat them. Without realizing that, and Emma has mentioned levels of corruption in the army, but also the fact that drug cartels are so well organized, better equipped to fight that kind of war than the army, because the army was never involved in this kind of fight. And because they have corrupted police forces and the judiciary, it's easy for the drug cartels to control this. So they could, Felipe Calderón failed in all sense of the word in his personal war, against the drug cartels. And what's happened now is that people were so fed up with the situation that they have created vigilante groups, mentioned mainly in Michoacán. And the government, the current government, which is the PRI, which were kicked out of government sort of 10 years ago, and now they are back in government, what have decided to do is they have decided to legalize those vigilante groups, and the army and the police are working together with them. So instead of fighting them, they realized that people were so fed up with the lack of action that they decided to take weapons in their own hands and fight them. And now the army and the police are actually working with vigilante groups. This could create a dangerous precedent, because it would give local communities sort of military status. We don't know yet what the consequences of these policies will be, but at the moment, that's all the government can do is try to use these vigilante groups working with the security forces. Now, because of all this, there's been a lot of debate about how to deal with drugs and how to make sure that this doesn't destroy our development as a region. Because of the economic element of drug traffic that has infiltrated the normal economy. I've been to parts of the Amazon in my country where I have been able to see and talk to people there. And they can tell you very easily, there are regions in the Amazon, Peru, Colombia, where the economy is based on drug. Whether you are a coca leaf producer who sells the coca leaf to the makers of the cocaine, or whether you are sort of working in a company bought by drug traffickers because of the money laundering. If you take away from one moment to another the drug from that region, the whole of the economy could collapse. So they have become very dependent. Because there are remote areas in Latin America, it's very difficult to have access. These drug traffickers have planes and land strips and all that, and they control communities. And as we know in the case of Colombia, sometime in the case of Peru, the Farje have been linked with drug traffic, and in Peru the old Shining Path movement were linked with drugs. So there's been a debate about what to do with this. And both the US and the UN have approached, according to many people, analysts, including this Global Commission on Drugs, the wrong approach. The prohibitionists have got it completely wrong. For starters, the classification of drugs is 50 years old. They're still using sort of templates from 50 years ago. They're still using the same thing, and attempts to legalize those elements which are part of the drug traffic, but they are not necessarily, they don't have to be necessarily part of it, have failed. Bolivia has tried many years to have some of the coca legalized, because coca is used, as we know, for medicinal purposes. Bolivia has failed. The US and the UN refuse to do that. And this kind of approach is preventing the war from becoming more flexible, because it doesn't have the flexibility enough to find different alternatives. No, we go with the army, we go to the intelligence services, we go to and we kill them all, and we just put it away, and we just destroy the plantation. It hasn't worked. The whole period of the war on drugs has not worked, it's not working. So basically, what the idea now is to start debating the possible decriminalization of certain drugs, as it has happened in Uruguay with marijuana. Now, when we're talking about that, we're not talking about buying cocaine over the counter. You go to the local equivalent of us and say, can I have a kilo of cocaine, please? No. That's not the point. The whole point is to start decriminalizing those who are the victims of the drug traffic. Not only those who take drugs, but the persons who have to grow coca leaf. There was a period mainly in the Amazonian country, the Amazon basin, where governments tried to encourage peasants to replace the coca leaf plantation with normal crops. But these crops had very bad prices in the international markets. They never had the help to be able to market the crops. So they went back to coca leaf because it was cash in hand and they could support the families. So there have been these attempts to replace the coca plantations where, I don't know, bananas or cocoa have failed because the prices in the international markets have not benefited those who were supposed to replace these plantations. They have come back to that. Also, it has had terrible consequences for the environment. Coca takes a lot of water. You need a lot of water to grow coca leaf. And they usually grow in what we call Sierra Alta, the highest slopes before you go down to the Amazon, between the Andes and the Amazon. That's what they grow. Some years ago, there was a huge epidemic of fungus that destroyed all these coca leaf plantations, and many peasants decided to move to the lower rainforest to grow coca leaves in lands which were not suitable for coca leaf. That meant that when it rained, all these plantations sucked all the water that was supposed to water other plantations, but also destroyed part of the normal ecology of the region, because they were desperate to grow the coca leaf that would give them sort of cash. Which means that we're talking about a situation where this has a lot to do with the economy of the region, and also the communities have been affected by this. So the main consequences are, of course, the presence in the economic structures of the nations, with the cocaine, the drug traffic, creating some kind of dependence in areas where the raw material is grown and cocaine is produced. The infiltration in the political structure, as it happened in many countries, or in the army, as Ed explained very well. Also, the creation of the new Latin American market, that is born from the economic growth that Latin America is experiencing. More violence. You know that you have read and seen the war on drugs in Mexico is extremely cruel and extremely nasty. And again, going back to it, the global war on drugs has failed, as the Commission on Drug Policy reported in 2011. So what do they suggest? What's the point for them? Instead of spending $7.3 billion between 2000 and 2010 for the Plan Colombia, what about trying to tackle it in ways that you can control the traffic of drugs? They recommend, I'm going to read you just the headlines of the recommendations this Global Commission did, because they are very interesting. First of all, they say that they have to end the criminalization, marginalization, and stigmatization of people who use drugs but who do not harm to others. Encouraging experimentation by governments with models of legal regulation of drugs to undermine the power of organized crime and safeguard the health and security of their citizens. Offer health and treatment services to those in need. Applying much the same principles and policies stated above to people involved in the lower ends of the illegal drug markets, such as farmers, couriers, and petty sellers. Many are themselves victims of violence and intimidation or are drug dependent. Invest in activities that can both prevent young people from taking drugs in the first place and also prevent those who do use drugs from developing more serious problems. Focus repressive actions on violent criminal organizations, but do so in ways that undermine the power and reach while prioritizing the reduction of violence and intimidation. Begin the transformation of the local drug prohibition regime, changing about classification of drugs and all that. And last and certainly not least, break the taboo on debate and reform. The time for action is now. And this Global Commission is not just anyone. It was very important personalities, former president, Mario Vargas Llosa, the writer, Richard Branson. It's a group of people who were involved in this. So basically, to tackle it, you have to change the approach that Latin America has. And also make sure that those who are the victims of the drugs are not penalized. But at the same time, to make sure that by taking the oxygen away from the drug cartels, you will be able to guarantee that the development of the region is without any problem. Parts of Mexico are still developing economically, but parts of Mexico have already been invaded by the drug traffic, like Monterrey, one of the biggest, most industrial parts of Mexico. Now drug cartels are starting to work there. Once you take away the influence of those cartels, you will be able to develop the region in a better way. We could have spent the whole evening talking about this, but basically in a nutshell, that's how drugs operate, and maybe the solution is to start talking about that and debating how we can change the fight against drugs. Thank you very much.
And now Rodolfo's giving us maybe a better image of Latin America.
Okay, good. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Is that a beer or what? No? Transmitted here? Okay. So my name is Rodolfo Milsei. I am from Argentina. I gave a speech last year in another university, maybe because of my age, because we are talking here about 20 years now, the perception of Latin America. And I asked everyone, what is the first thing that you think or comes to your mind when you think about Argentina? And I thought they were going to say Maradona, but they all said Messi. So it's good because we still have the best player in the world. But 20 years is perhaps for me or for Javier, but for sure not for you. Like the tango says, we have a tango that says 20 years is nothing, or 20 años no es nada. Who speaks Spanish here? Here, 1, 2, 3, good. ¿Hablas bien? ¿Sí? Un poco? So the tango says 20 years is nothing, no? And yes, for us, maybe not, it's nothing, but what it happens in Latin America is quite a lot. So we believe that for Latin America, it has been very good 20 years, and of course very, very different at the same time. So very quickly, my background is journalism. I'm a journalist by profession. I worked in Argentina first when I was 15 years old in a regional radio. I started doing a sports program, and then I worked for 10 years in television. I never worked in a newspaper. That's why it's difficult for me to say that I'm a journalist. But yes, this is what I studied. And then I came to London when I was 28 years old, appointed by the government of Argentina as a press attaché of the Argentine embassy. And that was 12 years ago when Argentina was in the middle of a big financial crisis. So my appointment was with the intention of rebuild the relationship with the British media that, with many reasons and very good reasons, was quite tough on Argentina. But as you can see, it's still tough on Argentina. But I'm a very optimistic person. I believe that perhaps we are going to disagree in some of the things that you said, but my view on Latin America is very positive. I'm so excited about what is going on in Latin America, and I invite you to go and visit it, because yes, there are of course a lot of issues, there are of course a lot of bad news that you can see and you can read in the press, in our friends, or the Financial Times, or Reuters, or Bloomberg, all this media, even sometimes in this university. But what is going on is exciting. And I'll tell you why it's exciting, because I am 40 years old, and as I said, 20 years is nothing, but in Latin America, for example, 20 years ago, Chile, the most stable country in Latin America, the country that everybody wants to copy because it's a good example of tidiness, good policies, financial stability. So Chile was just awakening of democracy. So in 93, 94, it has had only 2 or 3 years of democracy after 17 or 18 years of Pinochet in power. So, for example, countries, like you said, with all the bad things that are still happening in Peru, in 20 years ago was still threatened by terrorism, by Sendero Luminoso. And today it is a different country. I perhaps highlight, because I'm in the PR industry, always the best of all the countries, and perhaps it's a different view, but today Peru is Gaston Acurio, the chef with the gastronomy, is Jorge Pizarro in the Bayern Munich, champion of the Champions League, is also Claudia Llosa that last week, for example, presented a fantastic film in the Berlinale. Argentina as well, Argentina in the 90s, even though all the countries like Brazil, like Uruguay, were already in democracy, maybe in the first decade of democracy, but there was still threat to democracy by the militaries. So even though Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil are being in democracy for 30 years, still 20 years ago, were still threatened by the militaries. Colombia, it was a very, very, very dangerous country. Pablo Escobar was still alive, the drug baron of Latin America. I invite you to research about Pablo Escobar, to research about one documentary that I saw recently on Pablo Escobar's son, how he finds reconciliation with the sons, the children of a political candidate that was killed by Pablo Escobar. So, and this is exactly the difference between 20 years with Pablo Escobar alive, killing people, and now the son of Pablo Escobar reconciliating with the children of another political candidate. Argentina, for example, my country in the 90s, when I was 20 years ago, was the Menemismo. No? I don't know if you know about Carlos Menem, the ex-president of Argentina. The $1, 1 peso was a country that was living in a little bit of fantasy, was perhaps a country closer to what the film was Wall Street says, no? Greed is good. And then in 2001, 2002, we saw the devaluation, and then a few years later we saw what is maybe seeing now, but it's also the country of Francis the Pope. So in a way, 20 years you can see that there are many differences, and of course Pope Francis doesn't agree with what we used to live, that we did this good 20 years ago. So this is why I am a very optimistic person in terms of what is going on with Latin America. I started the company Grande Latin America 10 years ago after my experience at diplomatic level, where still in the UK, no, it's not maybe 20 years ago, but I'm talking about 10 or 11 years ago when I first thought about this project. There was no BRICS, so people was not talking about Brazil and the World Cup, Brazil and the oil, Brazil and the Olympics. It was a region that was more considered like once in a lifetime region, a backpacker region, and now it's, I believe, more glamorous, more trendy with spectacular hotels, and actually one of the fastest growing regions in the world. So we see Paraguay, yes, 13% GDP growth in 2013, Panama, 10%, and now the widening of the Canal of Panama. We see Peru with 6.5%, and they were a little bit depressed because it was 6.3% growth instead of 6.5%. So we are seeing a different Latin America, and this is why I launched this in 10 years. I think even the British, who is British here, by the way? 1, 2, 3, okay, good. So the British perhaps changed the perception in a way that you were more familiar with Australia, you were more familiar with India, with the Commonwealth, but not very familiar with Latin America. And from that point of view, I believe that the Brits are now, in comparison to 10 years ago when I started this project, now choosing for Latin America for the gap year more than other parts of the world. So yes, we still have a lot of faults, a lot of issues. I'm not happy, I'm very sad with what is going on in Venezuela. A government that is not governing to everyone, at least one sector. But a part of what is going on in Venezuela, and by the way, Venezuela was, with all the faults and all the problems, has elected the president that is now in power. So there are issues everywhere in the world. I sometimes see that the press is highlighting with a little bit of a stereotype all the demonstration, all the problems, issues still in Latin America, but you can see that in Ukraine, for example, there is a weak government, and now the government has established the amnesty for the opposition. In Bosnia and Serbia and Montenegro, there are demonstrators taking all the government palaces. In Thailand, the opposition taking the streets since months ago. In Egypt, as you know, on and off demonstration, as well in many other countries in the Middle East. And in the UK, not much going on, which is also, I think, quite worrying. But yes, of course, we have a lot of faults. We have the drug trafficking issue. We have the defense issue. I still, maybe perhaps I'm irresponsible to say that, but when you show the chart on say that the United States and the UK were one of the best behaved after Australia countries in terms of defense deals, for Latin America, I don't believe it.
Corruption risk.
Yes,
not actual corruption. That's the point.
Corruption, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. But in defense in particular, I think in terms of war and in terms of what is going on in the world, the countries that are more involved in the war are those countries, America and the United Kingdom. So my point is, do not believe in what you read. Do not believe in stereotypes. Do not believe in NGOs. Do not believe in universities. Just visit Latin America. Just do not believe in the economics, of course. You can read it, but just don't believe it. And yes, perhaps we are a bit crazy. Perhaps we are not that well organized, but we have improved in that sense. When I first arrived in London, the stereotype for Latin America was Mañana Mañana, which is a Fawlty Towers series in the 80s. And perhaps we don't say now Mañana, we say in a couple of hours. But I think we are getting better, and this is why the country is really excited about what's going on in Latin America. So because I think the most interesting part of this kind of talk is the question and answers. But in the view of what is going on in Latin America, there are so many things to improve. There are so many political issues to be resolved, but luckily we are all in democracy. So if there is a political issue, the people has the opportunity, as it didn't happen 20 or 30 years ago, to vote. And yes, there are still demonstrations, there will always be, but the most important thing is that we believe, all of us, in democracy. Only Cuba is a country that has to improve on that matter. Hopefully they will do it soon. But we can all say that there is freedom and there is the possibility of voting in all our countries. Branding Latin America is a public relations company. Of course, as you can see, my speech is quite public relations. I'm positive on what is going on, but I really believe in that. It's not because I'm a professional, It's because I feel it, and hopefully you will feel it soon, especially after this conversation and after this talk. And by the way, as you talk about internships, I also have internships, so please do not hesitate to contact us if you want to do an internship. So 3, okay, good. 4, and like us in Facebook, follow Twitter, Branding Latam. There will be more here, over there, please. Follow Branding Latam, and if you have taken photos of this, please put at Branding Latam so we can retweet you. And anything that you need or any interest that you have in terms of Latin America, we are very happy to help you and to invite you to our events. So thank you very much.
All right, so we'll just close on a high note. So, does anyone have any questions for our panelists?
I would actually like to begin with a question. Because as you said, as you're like really optimistic about the whole Latin American situation, what would you say about like Venezuela experiencing a trend towards communism and like the demonstration now? Would you say it's a sign of hope, or?
Yeah, but the trend on communism is what the people here in London says. What the people is saying is voting, and is saying no, we are not, I don't know if to say in agreement, but they are voting for Maduro. So perhaps I do not agree with anything that Maduro does, and I don't agree with anything that he does, but I will always defend first democracy. And Maduro was voted 1 year ago when Chavez died. Yes, you can say that maybe there was fraud, there was corruption, but there were witnesses. Jimmy Carter was in some of the elections in the last 10 years. Chavez won 10 elections. So it's very difficult to say, yes, it's going to communism. And what is communism now? So Maduro was voted, and I think that's the bottom line.
Yeah, I would like to add something to what Rodolfo said. By the way, I share his optimism. I was just dealing with articulation, but
I know that.
I completely agree with the situation has got much better in Latin America. We have overcome a terrible period of hyperinflation, debt, corruption, and it's getting much better. So it's good. In terms of Venezuela, absolutely right. He was elected. I was there. I've been traveling from Venezuela to Venezuela very often, and last year I was there to present some TV programs just before Chavez died. And basically, yes, during the government that Chavez ran, many changes happened in Venezuela, changes that didn't happen before. People had more access to education, health, yes, I mean, literacy increased by a great deal, and that's even recognized by the UN. It's true that he made mistakes, that the economy was not well managed. The dependency of Venezuela of its production of oil increased with Chavez to 94% from 70% before he took over in 1999. And of course there was some problems, but people were talking about suppressing freedom of expression. Sorry, I would get up early in the morning, at 7 o'clock in the morning, switch on the TV station, and they will have TV stations attacking him left, right, and center, calling him every name under the sun. So this idea that it was totally suppressed is not right, because I was there just recently, and I saw it. The problem was that because the process was personalizing Chavez, when he died, there was a kind of like an earthquake, and Maduro was not perceived as the right person because he used to be a bus driver, which I would like to remind my British friends that this country had a prime minister who didn't even pass the test for a bus driver, who was John Major. So we're going to start talking about that. let's just be very careful about how far we go with that. Maybe the mistake was that the transition was not as smooth as expected, because nobody expected him to die that quickly. But on the other hand, it's true. The problem is there's so much confusion in Venezuela at the moment, from both the opposition and government. Again, Maduro was elected properly and Jimmy Carter endorsed that. That makes it very difficult to just pick up a particular element. Everything has gone out of hand for both the government and the opposition, and the only solution now, and other countries have offered help, like President Santos from Colombia, to mediate, to make sure that there's some kind of some kind of agreement to avoid the bloodshed, which is getting out of hand. I think both have made mistakes, and there has to be a period where they have to come down and find some kind of mediation to make sure that things don't escalate, because they could get very serious. But yes, the government was democratically elected, and nobody can deny that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would add to that by saying, and this is maybe not in my role with TI, but more on the kind of academic research that I've done, that what's happened in Venezuela, I think, is partly a consequence of the populist trend that continues in Latin America. And I don't know what the other panelists think about that, but I think it's not necessarily helpful to talk about democracy or no democracy. It's more helpful to talk about the deepening of democracy in Latin America, and governance issues are really important to that, including corruption. And I think, you know, in part that's what happens when you elect a populist leader. If you're not voting perhaps for the right reasons, if votes have been purchased, or not just, you know, for corrupt reasons, but well, when corruption occurs in a country, the government is obviously not legitimised. And it means that it's very complicated to see that the reasons that people are voting for a government, sometimes just from the buying of votes, but also, for example, the research that I did into Paraguay found that the political outsider figure, so someone like Horacio Cartes, who's the president of Paraguay at the moment, he has no political background, no political affiliation. So he kind of became popular in this populist movement because he was a business figure and was seen as outside of the current government, the current institution.
Is it bad for you that he was a businessman in Paraguay?
No, not necessarily, but the point is that he was painted as that kind of figure and as very clean from the system because of it, when actually in fact he had very corrupt links with the current government. So I think partly kind of the portrayal and the way that the campaigns are carried out is really important to looking at how democracy can be deepened in lots of Latin American countries. And I think partly that was a problem in Venezuela that I wouldn't claim any expertise
in Venezuela, I agree with you, but in Venezuela, in terms of to deepen democracy, Chavez was a good example of not making elections or doing elections every 4 or 5 years. He's done elections every year. During the 10 or 12 years that he's been in power, he did maybe one election every 1.5 years.
Sure, but
so that's to deepen democracy, to do elections every year.
It's about more than just voting. It's about other things as well. And you know, when you've got such institutionalized corruption, for example, that's a problem for deepening democracy.
I think that when you talk about what they call populism, which I'm not really sure I'm happy with that word anyway, you see what happened in Venezuela and Bolivia and Ecuador. These movements came because people were fed up with the traditional party that had been running the country for years. They were non-party people. Even Fujimori in Peru, who's rightly so paying, who spent the rest of his life in prison for violating human rights. He was a non-party person. Chavez was a non-party person because Venezuela used to be dominated by the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats for years, and they failed the people. So they became as non-party people trying to break the mold, the tradition and the structure of political parties in Latin America, including Uribe himself, who was a right-winger, but he came from a non-party tradition. So that was a shift because people were quite fed up with the way Latin America had been run. So, okay, there was a monster, but when you have a pop leader like that, it's also the work of the opposition to create leaders like that, because that's what happened in Venezuela, and it's happening in Bolivia. And I'm in principle against re-election, because we had that problem in Peru, and that's why we don't have re-elections, immediate re-elections in our constitution in Peru, and that's why the democracy is quite stable. You can start again, 1 period after you left office, but you cannot be re-elected. Since Fujimori tried to create a new constitution, which he was re-elected 2 or 3 times, and it has worked. In Peru, it worked, and I doubt that any president would dare change the constitution to go to re-election. So in principle, because of the very context of my country, I'm against re-election. But Chavez was re-elected once, and not only that, he lost the referendum once when they wanted to kick him out. He actually lost it because people got enough signatures, and he went to the people, and the people said, okay, you can stay. So it's not that he won everyone, he lost one, and he accepted that. So I agree with you partly, but also, where were the traditional parties that run Latin America for the last 60, 70 years? Well, they made an absolute mess of the situation, and that's where you get these leaders who might be populists, might be great leaders, it's up to you to decide that, but they are the result of this situation. Anyway, that's what I think.
And another thing, just finally, is that to say that Latin America is passionate about politics. This is why, in a way, if some people ask me, what do you miss about Argentina, what do you miss about Latin America, is the passion for politics. Here is exactly what I don't feel, passion for politics. And what is happening is because we are maybe too passionate, and what is happening is because the media is talking all the time about politics. Here you put BBC4 and they talk 1 hour about politics, the rest is about the Baroque and the history of Henry VIII. So I think it's easier to have political issues and problems and debates in a region very passionate about politics like Latin America than maybe a different culture, more maybe mature politically, but for me, more boring.
Do you have any other questions?
I have a question for you, Javier. Yes. You talked a lot about the drugs decriminalization and legalization.
Yes.
Which one would you prefer of the two? And how would you suggest for an American, say a Western politician, to adopt these principles in their campaign? Because ultimately it's political suicide if you try and say drugs are okay, and then they're never going to get elected.
That's
never
right.
vote for it.
There's a difference between decriminalization and legalization. I'm not, and the Commission doesn't suggest that we legalize cocaine, for example. We're talking about sort of drugs like marijuana. The idea is to decriminalize the consumption by people who take drugs. That's what they are suggesting. They're not suggesting that drugs should be sold freely. They're suggesting that it's decriminalized so the consumption is not punished by the police. That's the first thing. And also, that should be accompanied by treatment to encourage these people to reduce their dependency on the drugs. By doing that, you reduce the power of the drug cartel. But also, by decriminalizing certain drugs, you can control better the market and you will know exactly how they operate. Because we don't know now how they operate because it's a clandestine operation, isn't it? And no, so because they work with violence and all that. Whereas if you decriminalize certain drugs and you have a better way to control them, then you will be able to know, to spot where they are, how they operate, and that will take away a great deal of the market. The last thing drug cartels want is the criminalization of drugs. That goes against their own business. Now, the problem is that, and now we are starting to see the trend in Latin America. There's more debate about that. President Santos in Colombia has already started suggesting that maybe it's a good idea to start decriminalizing certain drugs, and he should know what's going on because Colombia has been, So, and President of Costa Rica as well has already spoken about that. He said, well, what about discussing this? Because they see the consequences of the failure of the war on drugs. So it has to be a pragmatic approach, but also the taboo of arguing and discussing this has to be broken. There has to be a debate about this. People run away and say, no, we fight it, we can't. So, no, come on, you have to break that. The UN and the US have to change their position, at least start listening to those who have a point to make. If the president of Colombia starts talking about decriminalization, he has a very good point because of the problem in Colombia. You have to listen to him. So Western democracies have to start accepting that debate, listening to what we have to say about that. Again, we're not talking about selling cocaine over the counter. We're talking about decriminalizing certain drugs that can be controlled and also not punish those who are the responsible, the victims in many ways, like peasants, farmers, and consumers. Then you can start reshaping the way you fight drugs. The question is not whether you stop fighting it, it's how you're going to replan that fight. That's basically. But the debate has to happen. That's the first step. I don't know if that answers you.
The debate is happening.
Yeah, I did my dissertation in the Water Department on the drugs violence in Latin America completed last year. And similar to the question that was just made, in that drugs almost seems like as much a secondary problem to the fact that you have the richest country in the world next to some of the poorest regions of Mexico. And it's just this disparate nature of the sort of supply line that goes up through Latin America. And I came to sort of see the drugs market. It's almost like, it makes it sound like I'm making some sort of left-wing point, that it's almost like the banking sector, in that it creates liquidity and huge amounts of money for small amounts of people. And that psychologically and socially, it essentially ruins the idea of poor people doing anything else. Sort of like you might have poor people wanting to be footballers, but you don't want them to have being capable accountants or something like that. So I'm not entirely sure what my question is, but sort of the point that drugs is sort of almost a second order problem compared to the poverty and the lack of accountability that you have, and whether you think government should work more on that than on shooting foot soldiers of the Gulf cartel.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, as I said at the beginning of my talk, this operates with supply and demand. It's the same principle. And when I talk about economy, the money laundering means that they invest in legal activities. That means that they infiltrate the normal economy. They have bank accounts, they have companies. You go to parts of the Amazon, they own bus companies, furniture. You have European furniture in the middle of the bloody jungle, for people say, because of money laundering. But they have become part of the economy. And they put money in the banks. And they, there's been scandals in Italy, for example, with mafia money in the Vatican Bank. It happens the same in Latin America. But if you have a better knowledge of how the market operates, because you decriminalize certain drugs and you can control the market, then you can prevent this money from infiltrating and intoxicating the normal economic cycle in Latin America. Because we don't really know in many ways where the money is. Maybe there are legitimate investments in big companies where you have drug traffickers behind. I mean, because it's kind of stuff we don't really know. So, yes, you're right. I mean, it operates like in any sort of economic structure, and in order to be able to take the oxygen from that, then you have to start debating and changing the way it's fought. Otherwise, we're going to continue this problem. And again, you talk about the market. The US is the biggest market. What are they doing about stopping that market, about helping the people? They're doing absolutely bugger all. Sorry, pardon my French. They're doing nothing. But they demand that we stop selling it. I mean, come on, sorry, you are the market. Without you, we wouldn't be in this position. And now that the market in Europe has increased, it's even worse. And what are the European countries doing in terms of stopping that market? As far as I can see, not much. And for as long as the market exists, the supply is going to exist. It's full stop. It's as simple as that.
I think it's interesting. I don't know if you're watching Breaking Bad. About the New Mexico in the frontier, I think it's a good example of the traffic and how people with no jobs or with no aspirations make money out of it. It's a good business.
Yeah, I think it was a great point that Javier made. How can you expect a farmer to plant a banana crop when they can make so much more money from a cocaine crop? And I think the emphasis has to be put, like you mentioned, on the demand rather than just the supply side.
Yeah, maybe one last question.
Just to expand a little bit on the cocaine issue that we had in Latin America. I'm Gerardo Lemos. I'm an international journalist. I used to work for CNN and American and Latin. I'm Colombian American. I was born in Colombia and I had to flee the country a long time ago, more than 20 years ago, so I know how it is. But one of the things that Javier, my friend and colleague, was sharing that is really important is that in the United States, they're not doing anything. I used to work with Nick Valencia and we did a special investigation. I went to Ciudad Juarez, I went to Tijuana, and you can see that there's a lot of corruption from both sides, because how can you explain that cameras that have to be 24 hours, 7 days a week, looking at certain directions, but certain times of the day, they just move the camera a little bit. If that happens, it's because there is a lot of corruption as well in the American government. They have drones flying continuously, but certain days of the week, they don't have the drones. And I remember when I was in Baja California, we were doing that investigation, and when we started exposing that, immediately we had to leave the country because our lives were in danger as well. There's a lot of problems in Latin America, especially Colombia, Bolivia, and Peru, but there's a huge market inside of the States. If we look historically, how come that Pablo Escobar was able to meet with senators in Miami and he had an apartment in South Beach? How was that possible? Not just him, but you look at so many drug cartels, and another big problem with the cocaine market is that it has a lot of links with the government. As an international correspondent, and because I have U.S. citizenship, I've been able to go to Colombia again and do investigations. And you look, since 1994, Ernesto Samper, the president, he was elected by the drug cartel of Cali, $3 million in cash just for his campaign. nothing happened. He was not touched. 1998, a new president came, he was focused on the peace talks with the FARC, but what happened? The FARC, they start fighting with the AUC, the paramilitary groups with the drug cartels and the Cartel de Norte del Valle, which was the second cartel, which started working with Mexico. And that, what happened? Alvaro Uribe came with a populist movement because they were tired of conservatives and liberals. He came to power. What happened? No one talks about him. His niece, his sister-in-law, they were sending extradition to the United States. How can you don't make the dots that he has a lot of relatives that they've been involved with cocaine market and he hasn't been touched? International courts have been making continuously statements about this guy and he hasn't been touched. So that's another problem that we have in the cocaine market. It has a lot of links with the government. I'm pretty sure when you were in Colombia, you were able to see those things. And of course, I mean, very few journalists like me, we expose those things and we have to flee immediately out of Colombia because it's not safe for us when we start talking about those things. The problem still in Latin America, but there's a huge problem in the United States. They're consuming a gram of cocaine can cost $400 right now. That's a lot of money. And they're not doing anything in America, and they're not doing anything in Latin America. They can say, yeah, plant a banana, yeah. They can plant bananas. They did it in Antioquia, and what happened? The paramilitary groups, they just came, ordered by Chiquita Banana, and they just swipe off areas, killing more than 3,000 people for those areas that they had banana plantations already. What happened? Nothing. Because the government is still doing anything. They made the peace talks with the AUC. What happened? They started exposing what was going on with narcotics and government. Immediately, what happened? The justice and true process, nothing happened. Until today, no one has been sent to prison. They were sent an extradition in U.S. and they cannot talk. Salvatore Mancuso is continuously trying to talk. They never let him talk because there's a lot of links with the government and there's a huge problem not only in Latin America. We're doing the job. People want to change. I've been in those mountains. I've been in Cerro de Patascoy. I've been in Sierra Nevada. I've been in Peru. I've been in Bolivia. They want options. If you give them a good option, they're going to stop doing that.
Yeah.
But the government is still corrupt, and corporations are still working on that.
And Mexico has the highest rate of journalists killed because they try to cover the war on drugs. So, you know, if you want to say something about it, you're dead. In Mexico, it's just a matter of death or life. That's simple as that. So it's really.
Yeah, I wanted to mention something that was brought up a couple of times as well, actually, about corruption and kind of the supply and demand of corruption. Because we do recognise in TI that for every corrupt deal, there's the person who accepts the bribe, but there's also the person who pays the bribe. And that often comes from Western-based companies, companies based in the UK, companies based in Germany, companies based in the US. Yeah. So that is something that we work on at Transparency International, and also in defence companies. So the sister project of the governance index is the companies index, and that looks at what measures companies have in place to prevent corruption and to kind of assess their own levels of corruption risk. That's not to say, because one of the things that you mentioned is, you know, how did the UK do so well in the governance index,
Yes.
for example? The governance index doesn't aim to measure corruption itself, because to do so is pretty much impossible. So, you know, the UK has had lots of high-level scandals surrounding defence procurement, like the BAE is the example typically drawn on, and that most people know about. The index looks at corruption risk, because we can't measure corruption itself. It's too covert. You know, there's just really no way of measuring it. We can't measure the scale or the actual kind of money changing hands. So what we try to do is measure the corruption risk and the systems that are in place at every stage to prevent that corruption from occurring. So it might be the political systems in place, the procurement systems in place, and not just in the government, but also how that works all the way down the chain. So one of the questions in the GI is around, does the government require defence companies that sell into the government to have anti-corruption measures in place? Do they require those companies to have corruption requirements in place from the companies that they procure from. So it's about addressing corruption risks throughout the chain of procurement. So yes, sometimes the kind of Western countries tend to do better in the GI, perhaps because they have more established democratic systems. But I think they're also a very accurate way of looking at kind of a contextual analysis of what the corruption risk is in that country.
Okay, as much as I would like to go on here, I think we could spend like a whole night talking about this subject. So I want to give you all a very warm thank you. So,